Well, thank you so much for having me here today and for attending this talk on a Saturday. I really appreciate it. So as Tally mentioned, my area of expertise is broadly on consumer financial well-being. I have three primary streams of research, and today I'm going to be focusing on my stream of research that looks at financial decision-making within romantic couples. So the paper that I'm going to talk about today is joint work with Joe Gladstone, who's an assistant professor at University College London. Joe and I both share an interest in consumer financial decision-making. And one of the reasons why we feel that this is particularly important to study among romantic couples is because we know that finances are a pervasive source of conflict within couples. And one of the reasons why finances are such a major source of conflict has to do with how finances are pooled. Right? So how do couples generally pool their finances? Well, if you look at married couples in the US, this is the breakdown that you typically see. So more than half of married couples in the US pool all of their finances by keeping them in one or more joint accounts. Close to 25% of couples use this hybrid approach, so they maintain both separate and joint bank accounts. And then 14% of couples, and I find these couples to be the most interesting, keep everything completely separate. And the question that Joe Gladstone and I are asking in this paper is whether or not the type of account one uses in turn affects the types of products that one chooses to buy. So something that I want to clarify up front, so when I say that I study financial decision-making within couples, people just assume that I'm going to bring couples into the lab and give them some sort of financial decision and observe how they talk to one another and the choices that they make. But in this paper, we made the conscious decision to take an individual rather than dyadic approach. And the reason that we decided to do that in this paper is because if you think about it, most of our daily purchase decisions are made in the absence of our significant other. So things like shopping for groceries, shopping at the mall, you tend to do these things by yourself, and you don't necessarily make your significant other go with you when you're making these purchase decisions. So in this paper, I'm looking specifically at individuals that are in committed romantic relationships, observing the type of account that they're using to make these decisions, and then looking at the types of products that they choose to buy. Right? So this is the theoretical model that I'm aiming to test in this paper. So more specifically, what we're hypothesizing is that individuals that are spending money from a joint account experience a greater need to justify spending to their significant other, which then causes them to prefer utilitarian products over hedonic ones. So given the nature of this audience, I just quickly want to clarify what I mean by utilitarian and hedonic products. So utilitarian products are products that are more functional. They tend to be viewed as more responsible products. Hedonic products are products that you tend to purchase for pleasure or for fun. All right, so before I dive into the data and the studies, I just wanted to provide a bit of intuition for why we're hypothesizing this in the first place. So to date, there isn't a ton of research on the psychology of maintaining separate versus joint accounts, but there is work on this related concept of mental accounting. And so mental accounting is this idea that money set aside in these different mental accounts in turn affects how we think and feel about it. So what we're suggesting in this paper is similarly that money that's set aside in different accounts, separate versus joint, in turn affects the need to which you feel you need to think about your partner or consider your partner when you're making spending decisions. Right? So in the absence of past research on the psychology of separate versus joint accounts, we consulted secondary data. So my co-author and I analyzed what's called the British Household Panel Survey, which is this publicly available data set in the UK. And what we found in this data set is that people that use joint accounts to make purchases indicate to a greater extent that they feel this need to ask permission from their significant other before they make purchases. So this is in line with our intuition or hypothesis that those spending from a joint account experience a greater need to justify their purchases. Also importantly, when it comes to research on justification, we know that being able to justify our actions allows people to avoid conflict, which is important given the fact that money is such a pervasive source of conflict in relationships. When we look at the second link, so the need to justify on product purchase, so there's quite some research demonstrating more generally that utilitarian products, or these more responsible products, are much easier to justify than hedonic products. So for example, we know that it's much easier for us to come up with reasons for why we need to buy utilitarian products than hedonic products, and the more reasons we can come up with, the easier it is for us to justify these types of purchases. Right, so this is the model, once again, that we're aiming to test in this paper. And to date, the paper has 5 studies. Right, so in the first study, what we wanted to do was analyze real spending behavior. So in order to do this, we partnered with Barclays Bank in London. And with the permission of customers at Barclays, of course, they gave us access to a year's worth of transaction data from some of their customers. So what we did with this data was we sent these customers a survey that was then linked to this transaction data. And we asked them 2 things in the survey. So we asked them first, are you in a committed romantic relationship? Because in this study, we want to focus just on people in romantic relationships. And second, we asked them, does this transaction data come from a separate account or a joint account that you hold with your significant other? So those are the things that we know. Right, so in total, we had 396 customers that agreed to give us their data linked to this survey. And among them, 281 of these participants gave us spending from a separate account, 115 came from a joint account. And in total, this left us with 160,000 transactions. So we looked at this transaction data. And just to give you an idea of what the data looked like, so Barclays Bank groups these transactions into various spending categories, right? So we know for each spending category how much money individuals spent on each category over the course of a year. All right, so we took all of these spending categories, you can see them here, supermarkets, gas, trains, pharmacies, etc. And we gave these spending categories to British raters, and we had them rate each category in terms of how hedonic and how utilitarian it was. And then we used these ratings to classify these spending categories either as utilitarian or hedonic. Right? So if something could not cleanly be classified as one or the other, and there were 7 categories that we could not cleanly classify, we excluded them from this analysis. So this analysis just focuses on the remaining categories that you see here. Right? So these are the categories that we have. Right? I won't spend too much time on the nature of the model given the audience, but just to give you a general idea of what we did. So we ran basic regression. So the predictor was whether or not spending came from a joint account or a separate account. In our first regression, we look at the total amount of money spent over the course of the year on hedonic products. In the second regression, we're looking at the total amount of money spent over the course of the year on utilitarian products. And we control for total spending over 12 months. Right? Right? So what we see here, so if you look at model 1, you see that there's this negative relationship between spending from a joint account and spending on hedonic products. And this relationship remains negative and significant when we control for all of the things that we can control for that we measured in our survey. So we know whether or not that person has children, if they're married, their gender, their age, how much money they have in savings, etc. But the important thing that I want you to focus on here is this negative relationship. So what does this mean in English? Well, this means that compared to these separate account holders, joint account holders are spending on average 490 less pounds on hedonic purchases. Right? So we see this negative relationship when we look at hedonic spending. What happens when we look at utilitarian spending? Well, we see the exact opposite. We see a positive relationship. Right? And this positive relationship, once again, remains significant when we control for everything we can control for. Right? So To be more specific, so compared to separate account holders, joint account holders are spending 1,149 more pounds over the course of a year on utilitarian purchases. Right, so we see these relationships play out in this real spending data, right? So there are, of course, some issues with this data, right? It's not perfect. So the most basic criticism that one could bring out is that correlation is not equal to causation, right? So I'm an experimentalist, so how do we take care of this in the lab? So we take care of this via random assignment. So what we did in the next study was we randomly assigned participants to use either their separate account or their joint account, and then we observed which product they decided to purchase. Right, so how did I do this? Well, I collected data during one of Notre Dame's Football Fridays. So not sure if you know this, but at Notre Dame, football's kind of a big deal. So lots of alums come back to campus at this time, and I specifically recruited that segment of the population that has access to both separate and joint bank accounts. And then I randomly assigned them to use either their separate account or their joint account, and then I gave them a product choice. Right, so more specifically, what did this look like? So I set up in the student union, and lucky for me, it was raining that day, so there was a lot of foot traffic throughout the student union, and gave participants a survey. So after asking them these basic demographic questions, verifying that they have access to both separate and joint accounts, participants were randomly assigned to either remove their separate bank account card or their joint bank account card. So they actually took their card out of their wallet, and we said, all right, this is the card that you're gonna use to make this purchase, and we presented them with this product choice. So I pre-tested these products very extensively. So in this case, the beer mug is meant to be more hedonic, the coffee mug is meant to be more utilitarian. But importantly, because they're both Notre Dame branded products and they both have the victory march on the back, they were both liked to an equal extent. So it's not the case that one of the products is more desirable than the other. All right, so what did we see when we gave them this choice? Well, we saw that amongst those that were asked to consider making this purchase using their joint bank account card, they were more likely to choose the coffee mug, which in this case is the utilitarian product, over the beer mug, which in this case is the hedonic product. Right? So we see this play out in real product choice with random assignment. Right? Also, I'll briefly go over this study just to give you a complete view of everything that I've done. But so one of the criticisms that reviewers brought back is they said, well, on average, people tend to have more money in joint bank accounts than in separate bank accounts. So we ran another study where we brought people into the lab and we gave them all the same amount of money. So we held the amount of money fixed, and we just framed whether or not the money was joint, so money that we gave to both them and their partner, or separate money that was just for them. And they then used this money to buy one of two fabulous Notre Dame calendars. So either this football calendar that was pre-tested to be more hedonic, or this university calendar, which was pre-tested to be more utilitarian, and we saw the exact same pattern. So when you give people joint money to spend, they prefer the utilitarian product. When you give them separate money, they're more likely to choose the hedonic product. Do I control for
gender?
Yeah, so gender is probably the most common question I get, right? Are there gender effects? And I actually don't see any gender differences across any of my studies. And more generally across any of my work with couples. So I have another paper on financial infidelity where I look at what motivates people to hide saving or spending. Also, no gender differences, so.
Hide savings, sorry.
Yeah, so that, I can present that project next year. So we'll focus on this one today.
Okay, income levels. One pair who makes small income and pair who makes that much income.
Yeah, so I do see this across a range of income levels, but one could imagine that amongst the super wealthy, you would not see these effects. And I don't have the super wealthy in any of my data, but across low to middle income, I'm seeing these effects. Mm-hmm. All right, so we see this robust effect. So why is this happening? Right, so if you recall from the conceptual model, I hypothesized that it's about justification and the need to justify spending to your partner. So in this next study, we're actually going to test this mechanism. Right, so how did I do this? This was run on Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Once again, recruited people with access to both separate and joint bank accounts, randomly assigned them to consider spending from one or the other, once again gave them a choice between a hedonic and utilitarian product. Right, so how did I do this? So randomly assign them to imagine that they have to use their separate bank card or their joint bank card. In this instance, we gave them a choice between choosing clothes for fun or clothes for work. And then we had them rate the extent to which they felt they needed to justify this choice to their partner and to their self. Right? And so the reason that I had them rate both of these things is because I wanted to make sure that the justification mechanism is specific to the partner and not to the self. So this enabled me to test these competing mechanisms. Right, so once again, same pattern. Those that were asked to consider spending from a joint account were more likely to choose the utilitarian product, clothes for work, over the hedonic product, clothes for fun. And we see that it's really this need to justify spending to the partner rather than to the self that's driving these effects. Right? So in other words, those that consider spending from a joint account indicate to a greater extent that they need to consider their partner when making purchase decisions, and this need to justify spending to their partner is causing them to prefer these utilitarian products over hedonic ones. Right, so what does this mean? Why is this important? This means that if we provide people with situational circumstances that reduce the need to justify spending to their partner, then these differences that we're observing among account types should ultimately disappear or attenuate. Right? So more concretely, when people think about spending from a joint account, they envision situations like this, where I've spent something and then the bill comes back and my partner says, did you really go and spend that money on this thing? So in response to situations like this, we find that when we tell participants to imagine that they're the only one that's going to handle the finances, their partner's not going to be able to see the bill, we find that these differences between account types on spending disappear, and joint account holders are then more likely to prefer these hedonic products, right? Similarly, if we give them an excuse or a license to indulge, like telling them that they're spending for a celebration or a gift for someone else, this also attenuates the effect. So providing these licenses, so what we call licensing effect in the literature, reduces this pattern and causes those spending from a joint account to shift their choice share more towards hedonic products. All right, so if we return to this question that I posed at the beginning of the presentation, does the type of account one uses affect how money is spent? So on average, yes, we see these very robust findings over and over again that those spending from a joint account are more likely to choose these utilitarian products. There are, of course, situational circumstances that mitigate these findings, but on average, we do see these effects. And why is this important? Well, this is important because we're actually starting to see this shift such that more and more couples are actually choosing to keep their money separate. So this 14% of couples that are keeping everything completely separate is actually growing more. And this could potentially have implications for responsible or utilitarian spending if you think about this in the context of the results that I'm showing today. Right? So with that being said, I'll keep it short and sweet, happy to answer questions, but that's all the slides that I prepared for today, so happy to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for generously leaving time for questions.
Yeah, I found that it's always helpful.
Please press your microphones when you talk. Absolutely.
Great talk. So as the definition of the couple is changing in America today, so I want to go back to Professor Sudhir's question around gender. So did you sort of, even if your data didn't have it, any thoughts on the impact of this demography shift in the way the decisions are being made?
So when you say demographic shift, what specifically are you?
I'm talking about the LGBTQ couples that are coming in, and the his and her slide sort of triggered that question.
Okay, great question. So in relation to that, so my co-author actually has data, so I'm actually not on these projects, where he focuses on homosexual couples specifically, and he doesn't see differences in the research question that we're investigating in this particular paper, but I know that one of his main areas of interest is whether or not there are important differences between heterosexual and homosexual couples when it comes to financial decisions. So in the samples we have, we get maybe 1 or 2 in the samples. So yeah, it's too small to make conclusions thus far, but I do know that my co-author has a specific area of research on that, because it is a very important question. Yes?
Could you share an example of some of the types of purchases that you were unable to determine whether they were utilitarian or hedonic?
Yes, so there were 7 categories. The one that comes to that's top of mind was something like books, right? So you could imagine that, so if you just see the category books, that could be, maybe it's something you need to buy for class or for work, or you could think of reading for pleasure or for fun. So it's those sort of things that were ambiguous that we did exclude. And for those 7 categories specifically, reviewers asked us to then go back and analyze whether there were differences in the total amount spent on those 7, and there were not. Yes. Yes, you.
Did you notice a difference between debit accounts and credit accounts, as some people treat that money differently?
Okay, so great question that I probably should have made clear in the talk. So this data is from British participants, so people in the UK. And my co-author and I have discussed this at length. So this was specifically from their debit card. So in the UK, credit is typically not used as much. So we weren't able to observe their credit transactions. So we got their self-reported credit, but these were specifically for their debit transactions. So I apologize if that wasn't clear. Yeah. Yes.
So in the last part of the study, you looked, in the last part of the study, you looked at what kind of, I presume, communication or inducement changed the perception or changed the behavior between the hedonic purchases and the utilitarian. Did you vary the strength of the suggestion? This is for a celebration. This is going to benefit everybody. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes, so are you talking specifically for the birthday study or just in general?
Yes.
Yeah, so,
The great excuse.
okay, yes, so in our studies, we actually manipulated these in what I would say is a rather heavy-handed way. So birthday is an easy one where all you have to do is say it's your birthday, and people automatically, that's your one special day where you get an excuse to indulge. But from a marketing perspective, what we did, and this is no longer included in the paper, I was sad when the reviewers wanted us to take it out, but we had these advertisements where we gave people a various numbers of reasons for why you should purchase the product. And in this case, we looked at massages, right? So massages could be something that are very hedonic, right? I'm getting a massage at a spa, or they could be framed as something that's very utilitarian. I need this because I'm suffering from chronic pain. And when we listed 10 reasons why you needed to get a massage, then the effects attenuated because the massage was easier to justify. I've just given you 10 reasons for why you need to get this.
It really doesn't make a difference whether it's because I just want to feel good or whether my neck hurts.
So it was framed as also utilitarian, and then we gave them reasons. So the framing is very important. Yeah, the framing is very important because the same product category can oftentimes be classified as hedonic or utilitarian.
Yeah, there is a, you see, I did a similar study about 20 years ago in India, where husbands and wives, they married the employed woman versus non-employed woman. There was a lot of difference in decision making. Secondly, about the levels of education and intra-cultural marriages mistakes. Say somebody marries an Indian wife versus somebody marries Latin American or American. The type of compromises and type of understanding these people have, like my wife never objects to anything, whatever I say she will, and we have a joint account. So I think you have to go into a little deeper about intracultural levels of education and levels of income. Versus I'm giving you my own personal example. My sons, I mean, they are both, their wife and husband, both are doctors. And I see they never bother about anything you want to purchase, you purchase, no purchase, because money is never a consideration. So these
Oh, so they would be
kinds
one of
things,
the
yeah.
higher
You
higher
have to
income.
see in terms of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I definitely do think that income is probably a moderator that I'm not able
That
to
is
look
what
at,
I'm saying.
yeah, in my data set. So I would agree with you that amongst the types of populations that I'm looking at in my samples, that it's more likely, that the effect is more likely to pop there. So I would definitely agree that that's an important moderator.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
My question is around for the business community. Have you learned anything about, so let's say you make more of a luxury product, but your demographic is more likely to be married, not necessarily the case anymore, but let's just say for argument's sake that's the case. Is there a way they can describe the product in more of a utilitarian way to make it more appealing? Because I think for the business community trying to understand from your learnings, because intuitively it's nice to see it quantified, it makes sense, but what do you do with it, is my point. And would it be different for different types of products?
Yeah, so what I would say is that if you are trying to sell, so it's not even necessarily if they're married, right? It's if you have information on what their account structure
Yeah, that's true.
looks like. So if you have data on that, and you know, for instance, that most people are going to be spending from a joint account, then how you frame or position the product and how easily you make it able to be justified are probably two things that you can shift via promotion.
Okay.
And then you had a question as well, right?
Yeah, so I was wondering what might happen if I'm shopping for my partner using a joint account. So, do you think the need for justification would go up or go down?
Yes, so that's an interesting question. So I think that that would probably be akin to the birthday celebration effect that we find. So if you're buying something for your partner, it might, particularly if it's a gift, it's probably something that will be easier for you to justify, and hence spending can shift more towards hedonic.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
I had a version of sort of building on that do you think of this as, rather than being utilitarian versus hedonic, maybe it's about being mutually beneficial versus personally beneficial?
Yes, so that's something that did come up in the review process. So we actually found that it doesn't matter if the product is framed as something that's just for you or for you and your partner. It's about product type or category type. And so we find this across a variety of products, right? So clothes would be just for you, but the mugs, for instance, would be something that both of you could use. So it doesn't appear to be whether or not it's a product for you or for just for you or for both, but the category seems to be more strongly driving the effects.